All right, I'm going to continue my critical interaction with the interview that Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity did with Alisia Childers, talking about progressive Christianity. I posted previously in my last video a day or two ago, I guess it was, some of the comments that have come in that are critical of my previous video. One person said I was obsessed. So apparently, if you are offering a critique and people don't like the critique, then you're obsessed. Unfortunately, one other person said I think I'm in line with the devil or something like that. And then there was another comment, which is like, oh, I think that you need to talk to Cameron and to Alisia because I think you've misunderstood them. Okay, on that one, I have presented both of them with specific questions on Twitter. And Cameron in particular, he had responded to something I had posted on Twitter, and so I responded asking about when doubt is permissible and okay and when it isn't. And then I also asked Ms. Childers a couple questions, including a question, did she have permission for her pastor to be sharing publicly the fact that he had disclosed his doubt about the existence of God in this private study group 12 years ago? Have not heard back from either one of them. But regardless, I want to continue on now and take a look at our some further on into the interview. So I'm going to play some clips as she begins to talk about progressive Christianity, and I'm going to pause it here and there. Try not to interrupt too often, which breaks up the flow and I think is unfair to them as they're having their discussion. But I will interject here and there and offer some comments, kind of culminating in this video as to the definition she offers about what progressive Christianity is.
I wasn't trying to, but everything I believed had just been thrown out. And for me, because it had to do with the Bible. When I spoke to atheists on the streets, it was like, oh, but they just don't believe the Bible. But when someone was able to knock the legs out from under the Bible, at least at the time, caused me to doubt it.
Right.
It knocked the legs out of my whole worldview.
Okay, I have to pause right there. So here we see some of the very tendentious framing. What I mean by that is highly questionable framing that Ms. Childers is engaging in. She talks about people knocking the legs out of the Bible. What she actually is saying, although obviously she doesn't use this language, is that people were knocking the legs out of her particular interpretation of the Bible. And of course, it is a fatal conflation. If you equate your interpretation of the Bible with the Bible itself so that the interpreter disappears, and you are simply taking in the data of what the Bible presents to us and what we as Christians should believe about it. Because the moment you do that, any critique of that view is either you can't consider it because, well, it's the Bible and it's true, or if you do accept it, then Christianity becomes false because Christianity has been folded into this interpretation of the Bible. But in fact, of course, you can be wrong about your interpretation of the Bible, and the fact that people are criticizing your interpretation of it does not mean they are criticizing the Bible. Okay, let's continue.
Another interview I heard you were saying that this is actually that topic, the reliability of the Gospels is like that's what you nerd out on, basically.
Yeah,
right?
like textual criticism.
Yeah, and is that because when it was first raised, you were like, wait a second, this is
yeah, because for me, if the Bible wasn't true, I don't think I would ever become a progressive Christian. I think that if I thought that Christianity was false, I wouldn't become a progressive Christian. I would just probably become some kind of agnostic.
Okay, this is, again, very interesting language that she uses here. She says, if I believe Christianity was false, I wouldn't become a progressive Christian. As if progressive Christians, quote unquote, believe Christianity is false and then become progressive Christians. I mean, that makes no sense at all. What a quote unquote progressive Christian is doing is concluding that previous views they held about what Christianity is are false. And in fact, the new view that they are adopting is a more faithful distillation or articulation of what Christianity truly is. What you see here, once again, as with the previous point I just made about the Bible, is that Ms. Childers constantly, repeatedly collapses her particular understanding of the Bible or of Christianity into the Bible or Christianity so that there's no possible separation between the two. So that to conclude that her particular views are wrong right now just is to conclude that Christianity is false. And of course, that's not true at all. And what she sets up here as well, because she's framed this issue in such a tendentious, uncharitable manner, is that the second that anybody continues to be a Christian while disagreeing with her particular understanding of what Christianity is, it follows that that person is doing so in bad faith. That in fact, they really do believe Christianity is false, but they're somehow continuing with the charade of pretending to be a Christian. I mean, that's the implication of what she's saying here. It's just as uncharitable as when Christians go around and saying the atheists pretend that they don't believe in God, but really at some level they do. And so likewise, she's saying, well, progressive Christians know that in their view, they believe Christianity is false, but they continue to pretend as if it's true, which is just such an uncharitable way of interacting with other people. Okay, let's continue.
That raises an interesting question. So do you think that progressive Christians think that Christianity is false?
I think they've redefined it in a way that if they gave you the definition of it, you would say, well, then you're just saying that it's false. And so this is why guys like...
Oh, no. Once again, we're not saying Christianity is false. What we're saying is your view of Christianity is false. And, incorrect at a particular point. But see, what she's saying here is, oh, well, okay, so now she's equivocating. She's redrawing her boundaries, because initially she said, well, when progressive Christians conclude Christianity is quote-unquote false, right, then they adopt progressive Christianity. Now she says, okay, actually what it is that, well, if they were to tell you what they now believe Christianity to be, you would say that is false. Okay, well, and I think your views are false in particular issues. Doesn't mean that I come out and say that you're not a Christian, and yet, of course, that's the implication of what she's doing here.
Like Bart Ehrman, Bart Ehrman, Bart Campolo, who is Tony Campolo's son. Tony is a famous, or he technically still considered evangelical, I think, but he's very progressive. But his son went through this type of deconstruction, but went into secular humanism. And his point is, that's really the more honest position. Because
what is secular humanism?
Yes, if you're going to start...
It's interesting how,
I'm just going to pause there. Sorry to interrupt you, Cameron, because he actually makes an interesting point here, which I'm going to get to in a second. But so there she says, she decides to quote Bart Campolo, who says, well, secular humanism is really the more intellectually honest position. And she wants to agree with that. So once again, what she ends up saying is, well, people who become more progressive than I am are not intellectually honest. The intellectually honest person in that context is the atheist. Now that is, again, she just chooses to quote Bart Campolo and his analysis rather than his father, Tony Campolo. Why? Well, because Bart Campolo suits her views better. It's easier to demonize and objectify and otherize progressive Christians if you quote Bart Campolo than if you quote Tony Campolo. So let's just quote Bart Campolo's view. You can do the same thing with Richard Dawkins, right? You could say, young earth creationists can say, well, if you reject young earth creationism, you might as well become an atheist. That's what Richard Dawkins says. So I'll quote Richard Dawkins. Well, why do you accept Richard Dawkins on that view but not on biology? Well, the reason is because you're just arbitrarily cherry-picking your sources. And what Alisia Childers is doing here is she's cherry-picking. She wants to otherize progressive Christians as intellectually dishonest because they disagree with her about something. And so she selects Bart Campolo and uses him as a basis to say that they're really not being intellectually honest, and if they were, they would just go ahead and become secular humanists. And what this does, among other things, is, the title of this video is so ironic. Progressive Christianity is dangerous. You know, once again, I talked about this already in an earlier video. What is actually dangerous is setting up people with these kind of binary oppositions. That either you agree with me and my understanding of Christianity, or the only intellectually honest and respectable thing to do is to become a secular humanist. Wow. Those are some nice options. So if I don't agree with Alisia Childers, I really should become a secular humanist, or I'm just being intellectually dishonest. Now, what's interesting then, I cut Cameron off here, is he actually takes he kind of flips what Alisia Childers says on its head. In fact, I'm going to back up just a little bit. Okay, let's go to here. Now, I want you just to listen to how he responds, because he actually interprets her in the opposite of what she intends. She wants to interpret and apply Bart Campolo's testimony here as somehow authoritative to kind of unveil the intellectual dishonesty and lack of integrity of progressive Christians. And what Cameron does when he responds is he actually questions Bart Campolo. So just listen to this.
Went into secular humanism, and his point is that's really the more honest position, because
what is secular humanism?
Yes, if you're going to start,
it's interesting how like honesty is always the thing.
I know, yeah.
Up here.
If
you're only honest if you agree with me.
Oh yeah, right.
But the only honest view is my view.
Right. But his point is that if you start getting rid of things like the Bible and the resurrection and the virgin birth and the atonement of Jesus, if you get rid of that stuff, it's really not Christianity anymore.
Okay, so this must have been a little bit awkward for Alisia Childers, because she's quoting Bart Ehrman here as favorably to say, well, he is showing us that the intellectually respectable thing to do if you reject my version of Christianity is to just become a secular humanist. And Cameron, I think, in his favor here, he kind of challenges that. And I don't know if that was in his intent to actually challenge Alisia Childers in her use of sources here, but he kind of points out the dubious nature of Bart Campolo suggesting that the only intellectually honest position is to follow me to secular humanism, and I think he rightly points out that is a highly questionable view. Now Alisia Childers throws in all these things that progressive Christians allegedly reject. So the atonement or the incarnation, or it mentions the virgin birth, and then the thing I would want to say here is you need to talk to specific individuals and find out what their view is and what they reject and what they accept and why. For example, I have a real suspicion here that when she says reject the atonement, what she really means is reject a particular theory of the atonement, because there are many different theories of the atonement, and the Christian Church has never decided on one of them or required one of them for orthodoxy. And I have a suspicion that really what she's saying here is a particular theory of the atonement. If you reject that, you're rejecting Christianity, which is highly questionable. And I haven't honestly listened to the whole entirety of the interview yet, so it could be, we'll find out later, whether she actually flags in particular penal substitutionary atonement as being the same thing as the atonement. But it isn't. Penal substitution is a theory of the atonement. Penal substitution is also a cluster of biblical metaphors of atonement that one, I think, can find in Paul and in the epistles of John, and are rooted in Hebrews to some degree, and they're rooted in the Old Testament sacrificial system. But there are other clusters of metaphor of the atonement, such as the law courts and the slave market, and the idea of exemplification or following Jesus, and so on. And so victor, Jesus as a victor in battle. There are many other different images and theories, or images, metaphors, and potentially theories of atonement that one can appeal to. One is not limited to a single one. So we really have to be careful about kind of throwing all of these things and saying, oh, progressive Christians believe all these things. And you actually need to talk to people. Don't broad brush them. Just like you shouldn't broad brush a quote-unquote conservative Christian, right? You actually have to listen to people. Okay, at this point, we're going to listen to how Alisia Childers describes progressive Christianity, and then we're going to leave it there. I'm going to offer some critical analysis of what she says about defining progressive Christianity, and then we'll stop this video.
Might as well just call it what it is.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. You also make a distinction between progressive Christianity and historic Christianity.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk about that a little?
Sure. Well, I tried to find a word that would describe the opposite of progressive Christianity. So maybe we can define progressive Christianity, and then I'll kind of give you why I chose the word historic. It's not perfect. There's no perfect word to use. So progressive Christianity is the idea that Christianity itself is progressing. So what I mean by that is of course we want progress, right? As Christians, we want to progress in our faith.
Seems like a good thing.
Seems like a good thing. We want to grow in our relationship with God and in our knowledge.
We want to be mature. We don't want to be infants.
Yes. We want to progress. But there's a difference between us progressing in our understanding of the eternal truths of God and those truths themselves evolving and changing and progressing.
Right.
So in the progressive view, what Moses wrote, well, they probably wouldn't even think Moses wrote it, but what the Old Testament prophets wrote about God speaking wasn't really God speaking. That was them speaking what they believed about God in their time and place. And so Peter and Paul, they don't really like Paul very much. They were writing their best understanding. This was Christianity in its infancy. This was the best they could do to understand God in their times and places. And so now we're evolving into a higher and wiser view of God. In fact, that's the phrase that one of the fathers of the movement, Brian McLaren, uses.
I'm just going to stop there. So I want to highlight, first of all, this another little thing she drops here. Progressive Christians don't like Paul. Once again, actually, what was going on here is, oh no, progressive Christians, first of all, many of them don't like your interpretation of Paul, which is quite a different thing than not liking Paul. Second is that many progressive Christians, or those who might call themselves that, they are redressing an imbalance in historic evangelicalism, which is focused on Paul, often at the expense of some of the things Jesus says, such as some of the things he says about the kingdom of God, which is very different than some of the narrower conceptions of salvation that some evangelicals have because of a particular reading of Paul, or what Jesus says about works and the role of works in salvation, which is very different than a particular Protestant reading of Paul. So it's not a matter of, well, they don't like Paul. No, they don't agree with your interpretation of Paul. Again, there is a difference. Just like there's a difference from them not agreeing with your interpretation of Christianity or them not agreeing with your interpretation of the Bible. Stop collapsing the two things together. Okay, the next thing is, I just want to comment before I wrap up, lest I be accused of being obsessive here. I wanted to end by commenting on the definition she gave of progressive Christianity. So again, progressive Christianity means that Christianity progresses over time and that the understanding of these truths actually changes. Yeah, this is what theologians call progressive revelation, first of all. So it is in fact the case that there is a growing understanding of God and how we relate to God and who human beings are over time. That actually is pretty standard stuff. People in the Old Testament did not have an understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity. That, in fact, doesn't even come in the New Testament. The seeds for the doctrine of the Trinity are found in the New Testament, but the doctrine is only really clarified into the 3rd and 4th centuries. Council of Nicaea, Council of Constantinople, Ephesus. That's the period in the 4th, well, the 300s and the 400s, when we begin to get the doctrine of the Trinity taking shape. The doctrine of the Incarnation is the same. Of course, in the Old Testament, there was no conception of a doctrine of Incarnation, although one arguably could find sort of anticipations of it in places such as the mysterious angel of the Lord language. But you don't have a doctrine of Incarnation until Jesus. And in fact, you don't really get the basics, planks of a doctrine of Incarnation being laid until it finally culminates through, again, a long process in the 3rd and 4th centuries, culminating in the Chalcedonian definition of 451. So yes, we actually do grow in our understanding. Now, if Alisia Childers is a good Protestant, she should believe, that at the time of the Reformation, there was a greater understanding of the order of salvation, or what theologians like to call in their highfalutin Latin, the Ordo Salutis. And we understood better at that time what oneness with Christ meant and what justification by faith meant, and maybe how conversion and regeneration relate to one another. And that led us into a period of scholasticism, sort of a new scholasticism. The earlier period was during the medieval period. And this was Protestant and Catholic scholasticism of the 16th and 17th centuries. And it was a very high-level theological analysis which yielded even further clarity. So, for example, we then came to understand really the difference between a Calvinist and an Arminian conception of election and providence. Or, within the Catholic tradition, the contrast between a Jesuit model and a middle knowledge model of providence and election. So yeah, there has continued to be development over time. That development is also reflective in other areas such as ethics. The fact that Christians for centuries accepted the practice of the institution of slavery, and then we came to recognize, oh, maybe actually slavery isn't a good idea. And in the 19th century into the 20th century, Christians began to campaign actively against slavery and even to recognize that very idea of slavery is a fundamental affront to the mandate of that there is neither slave nor free. Galatians 3:28, male nor female. We are all one in Christ Jesus, Jew nor Gentile. In all sorts of ways, the church has indeed progressed and developed. Israel progressed, and then into the New Testament times and onwards, Christianity has progressed. So if that's what progressive Christianity is, then we should all be progressive Christians. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about that Alisia Childers says there at the end is she talks about, well, the Old Testament prophets had particular false understandings of God. And Moses had a false understanding. Well, maybe even Moses didn't even write the Torah. Okay, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I've looked at the arguments for the four-source, multi-source theory of Torah, for the idea of distinct Yahweh source and Elohim source, etc. I find that evidence overwhelming. I do not believe that Moses wrote the Torah. I think the Torah was stitched together by redactors over a very long period of time from pre-existent sources. That doesn't mean I don't accept the Bible. That means I've persuaded by the evidence that Moses didn't write the Torah. And I'll tell you this, the idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch is not in the Apostles' Creed. So don't pretend it is. All right. The other thing I want to say is, yes, it is true that authors of Scripture had some false understandings about God. What? It's true. They did not believe there was such a thing as an incarnation, or that there could be. There's no evidence, certainly, that they believed that. Christians in the New Testament underwent a theological revolution because of progressive revelation. They came to understand God better. Christians in subsequent centuries who had the further articulation of the doctrine of the Trinity available to them, and they recognized that God is three distinct persons in one substance, equal from eternity, and that the Son proceeds from the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, or through the Son, that understanding was not available to earlier people. So they would have disagreed with us about that, and that reflects theological development and certain inadequacies in their idea of God. Another example, a very concrete one that I like to give people, is just read through the imprecatory Psalms. How often does the psalmist say that God hates his enemies? How often does the psalmist say that God laughs at the destruction of his enemies? And the psalmist longs to bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. He longs to have their backs bent and their children be childless and their spouses be widows, and to take their infants and smash them into the rocks. The imprecatory psalmist in his anger and rage is expressing an understanding of who God is, which is fundamentally incongruous with the way that God is presented to us in Jesus. When Jesus says in Matthew 5, "It has been said, hate your enemies, but I say love enemies and pray for those who persecute you," what he is doing is reflecting a different understanding of who God is. God does not engage in schadenfreude. God does not find joy and pleasure in the destruction of evil people and the wicked and those who are opposed to his kingdom. In fact, on the contrary, Ezekiel 18:23, God takes no pleasure in the suffering and the loss of the wicked. He wants everybody to be restored and reconciled to him. Is it possible that there are some incompatible depictions of who God is in the Bible? And could it even be possible that very incompatibility, that tension, is part of the glory and joy and goodness of the Bible. That it invites us into a conversation and to read the text through Jesus. And that the extent to which some places in the Bible are divergent from who Jesus is could be part of the providential point of the scriptures themselves. At the very least, we should appreciate that we can't assume with Childers that just because a person in the Bible, a writer or a particular character within the Bible, had an errant view of God, that God therefore, or an inadequate view of God, that God therefore was himself errant in including that perspective. God could have very good reasons for including the perspectives that are imperfect. And really, think about the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. We see darkly as through a glass. Then we shall see face to face. I would simply ask you, which Christian or which person in history, apart from Jesus himself, has not had to some degree an inadequate view of God, a view in need of correction and revision? Just because your writings end up in the Bible doesn't mean that they are protected from all need for revision. What did I just say there? Well, I'm not saying that you go and edit the Bible. What I'm saying, I believe actually in divine authorial inerrancy, meaning that everything that is in the Bible is there for a reason and God has purposed it for a reason. But that doesn't mean everything in the Bible is to be accepted in line with what the human author wrote. If the human author in the Psalms writes that God laughs at the coming destruction of the wicked, it doesn't mean that I should conclude, okay, God laughs at the coming destruction of the wicked. Instead, what I may conclude is that person was really angry at that moment and believed that God laughed at the coming destruction of the wicked. And sometimes when I'm really angry at people and I want to be vindictive at people, I too project my anger and rage onto them. I otherize them, and I hope that God destroys them, much like the psalmist did. And maybe as I identify with the voice of the psalmist in my own anger and alienation and rage, I can thereby be challenged to recognize the same impulses to hate and otherize my neighbor that are present in that psalmist in that moment. So the text is doing something powerful, but it may be very different than simply fact stating, right? God hates his enemies. Therefore, because the psalmist says it, we should believe it as such. Now, I know I'm beginning to ramble at this point, so I should draw this to a conclusion. Suffice it to say that when Childers talks about progressive Christianity, what she's actually talking about there, rather in, I think, a ham-fisted way, is progressive revelation. Yes, revelation and our understanding of it is progressive. Not just our understanding, but the revelation itself is progressive. There is a sense that the Council of Nicaea fulfilled a fuller understanding of revelation than was present in seminal form in the New Testament, just as the New Testament gave us a fuller understanding of revelation than was present in the Hebrew Scriptures. All right, so that's all I have to say now in terms of Childers and her understanding of progressive Christians. I will take a look in the next video at historic Christianity as she defines it, and maybe a few other things. And then I'm probably just going to leave it there, because if I picked apart everything that she says in this hour-long interview she has with Cameron Bertuzzi, I think I would have way too many videos, and I probably at that point would rightly be accused of being obsessed. So I'm going to just give one or two more critical videos on this just to show why I think that her views, it's not progressive Christianity that is dangerous, rather it is her strawmanning of a view that she doesn't like, which is dangerous. And it is her collapsing of her perspective into Christianity simplicator, or mere Christianity, which is dangerous.